Right. This needs a little bit of tightening. A lot of tightening. And yours needs to be turned on. Apart from that, we're ready to go. Just while things are getting sorted at the back, I just wanted to sort of point a couple of things out. Did you notice that Nick Brandel, the guy who was in the tram with me, did you get that Liverpudlian accent? Is that not unbelievable? That just comes from supporting Everton. And going to Everton about 10 times, and he comes back with an English, a Liverpudlian English. The other thing was in the basement of the Storting, the Norwegian Parliament, where they have the constitution. Do you remember? You would see the document with a lot of red seals on it. A lot of those are fingerprints because the first people who drafted that couldn't write. And that gives you a sense of what true democracy was. Because that was dismissed by many people as the peasants' parliament. And actually, peasants, as has been demonstrated, are pretty clever people when they're left to their own devices. Just to give you one wee indication of how that contrasts with us, and perhaps why, personally speaking, I've rattled on about land ownership for such a long time. Because the vote everywhere in the world was dependent on owning land originally, the breadth of your democracy and the ability to vote was directly related to the number of people who owned land. And so in 1814, that requirement to give the vote to men, over the age of 25 who owned land and officials and so on, that gave the vote to 45% of that group of men. The same condition written into the Reform Act of 1832 in Britain gave the vote to 5% of men, and in Scotland a shocking 2.8%. Now that's the different trajectory we've been on because of the thinness of the democracy created by a system in which land, that first powerful resource, was owned by such a tiny number of people. So when you see that constitution with a lot of fingerprints pushed into red wax, you're seeing a genuine representation of people power from 200 years ago. And that's the platform upon which every bit of Norway's success has been built. So, having said all that, you've now got a microphone that works?
I think so. Yeah, good. It's a bit high up for me.
That's Tammy Wynette and somebody else singing a duo with you, but anyway.
I certainly won't be singing, Lesley. I don't know about you, but... okay, well, I think the idea now is that we'll take some questions for Lesley. And I think somebody might have a roving microphone. I'm not sure. There was some talk about that earlier.
Right, nobody's
If
leaping
not,
around.
I'll just take questions and then we'll see how we go with that. If necessary, I can repeat them back.
One up the top.
Right, let's start with the questioner at very top at the back. Nope, well, that's the person with the microphone, okay. Sorry, it's been a long week back at Westminster. There's a lady down in the front here. I don't know if we've got a microphone downstairs. Have we? Great. Lady with her arm up here is going to ask a question. It's okay, there's a microphone.
Thanks. This is people power that you have brought to us here. How can we get this into every public space in Scotland? And thank you very much indeed. We need the people to see this everywhere.
Well, I wish there was a simple answer. It's not going to be shown on the BBC. It's not going to be shown on STV. I've got to say, I sent the Faroes film off to STV to see if they might be interested. I sort of concluded, perhaps unfairly, but I suspect not, that the BBC just wouldn't take anything on board that does have an underlying theme of independence in it. I wish the BBC would get to the stage where they could show something like this and show a very powerful alternative version of a vision of a powerful Scotland within the Union, instead of balance being a sort of fairly bland, kind of nothingness in the middle, where no one is able to state powerfully what they they see. So the way that this is getting distributed, however, is a beautiful way. It's you. And I mean, you know, I can see you're all a bit underwhelmed and you hope to add a better rabbit to pull out of the hat. That is actually Scotland's problem. It's only you. It's only me. And actually, the greatest resource, and any of you who've seen, how many people have seen the Pharaohs film? Well, if you haven't, do have a look. But there's a point in each of those other films where someone says, I think in the Pharaohs, it's Ollie who says, well, of course, the greatest resource of any country is its people. And when I've seen people watching the film about the Pharaohs, again, there's a certain sort of, because I'm not sure if Scots feel that. I'm not sure if we understand that we are our best resource for everything. And part of the reason is what you've seen, is because our democracy has never vested power in the people. It's been a business of carving up interest in London because that's what you could do. If you only had 5% of the people voting, you didn't need to get your bahookie out anywhere. You didn't need to learn to negotiate, as we're now discovering. You had the fiat that comes unfairly with, for this government, 37% of those who voted and 25% of the electorate to have 100% of the power. There's no other system in Europe that thinks that is a mother of parliaments. So you are the vehicle for everything. And to be fair, the Pharaohs film, which came out first, has had 160,000 views. That probably makes it the most watched documentary in Scotland this year without touching a broadcaster. And that's fine. I'm perfectly happy if people watch this on their own. The other point is, all you'd need to do would be to have some clashing football match for the moment that it was shown on the BBC, that hallowed moment, to simply go, you know, west. So this is okay. It's not ideal, but we're in a strange situation in Scotland, so it's fine by me.
Right. Did I see somebody upstairs?
I didn't actually have my hand up, but since you've pointed there.
Okay, sir, go for it.
Joanna, I just wanted to know when Hitler's going to fire the gun, because we're ready.
Well,
how could there be a better time after next week?
I don't know the answer to that question because I'm not the leader or the deputy leader of the SNP. Sorry, I don't know the answer to that question because I'm not part of the SNP. Sorry, the question was, when is Nicola going to fire the gun on a second independence referendum? The gentleman said that we're ready to go for it now. My answer is, I don't know the answer to that question because I'm not the leader or the deputy leader of the SNP. My view, and I've said it repeatedly, is we need to hold a constitutional referendum. That means otherwise it won't be recognised internationally. The result will not be recognised internally in the UK, or more importantly, internationally. So we have to find a way to hold a constitutional second referendum, and I can very much assure you that I'm working on that. And I made a speech about how we might do that in London on Friday, and if you go to my Twitter account or my Facebook page, you can see what I said about that. Yeah, I think we need to be thinking very carefully about our constitutional future. It's important not to get bogged down on process, but as a parliamentarian, I have to address process. But I think what's really important today is making the arguments for independence, and that's what I think Lesley's film does so admirably. But I hear what you say, and I hear your impatience, and I understand it. Right, lady there. Microphone down the front here, please. Thanks very much. And then somebody over here afterwards. We'll maybe take two together, actually. Good idea. Because we've got two people in the front row, so... If you can put your...
I know it's past pantomime season, but, you know, the top row. Anybody up there?
Right.
Lesley, I've seen all three of the films, and the thing that strikes me about the Faroe Islands and Iceland is that they grabbed the horn at the moment that they were able to, in that they wrote and said, we're going to do this. Iceland said, we are not prepared to be overtaken by the Nazis, and so we're going to be independent. And the Faroe Islands did a similar thing. And I think that it's time for us to grab that and say, no more. absolutely no more?
Well, Iceland was never likely to be overrun by the Nazis, it being, somewhat distant from the mainland Europe. But what's absolutely true was that Denmark, the mothership, was occupied by the Germans. And the Icelanders saw that opportunity. But it came after a number of things. I mean, they'd had what they call their sovereignty in 1918. That was a huge thing. The big thing as well, America came and built a massive air base. That made them realize that they were not a little toty insignificant island in the middle of the Arctic, or actually just subarctic. They were strategically powerful, and they would never be alone. They would never be unwanted. They would never be without that significance, and all of those things together encouraged them to take the leap. They had a referendum. It was, again, overwhelming. It was about 90% yes, but they did have a referendum. And then, as you say, they just sent a letter to the King of Denmark saying cheerio, which was, polite. And of course, a lot of Danes were annoyed with the Icelanders for choosing that minute to go. Actually, that caused a sort of knock-on effect, because the Faroese, tiny, plucky little Faroese, all 55,000 of them today, at the time probably about 30,000, they decided that they too would go for an independence vote, emboldened by the Icelanders. So they actually had a vote in 1946 after the war, and it was 50.7% yes, which scared the bejesus out of everybody, principally the Danish government, which then realised it had to do that thing that I think the British government is incapable of doing. It had to persuade them. It had to woo them. It had to make an offer. It had to negotiate. So it came up with an offer which gave the Faroese truly the world's most powerfully devolved parliament, with lots of aspects, including control over all communications, which is why they currently have the world's fastest mobile broadband. And because they have that fastest broadband, they were able to take on multinationals like Google when they excluded them from Google Street View by having Google Sheep View, where they were able to strap cameras onto the back of sheep and let them wander around the Faroes, transmitting quite a substantial amount of fur, of wool, but also the beautiful vistas of the Faroes, because wherever they went, they had 4G signal. You have it out to 80 miles from shore. And actually that embarrassed Google so much that Google changed their mind, and now Tórshavn is on Google Street View. So they had those powers, but the huge, whopping, important one they got in 1946 was they got the right to sign international treaties. 30,000 people. And for that reason, when Denmark in 1973 decided to join the EU, the Faroes, 94% of their income is dependent on fish, took one look at that, realised where that was going to go in terms of the common fisheries policy, and just went, nah. And they didn't sign. And I see some of us of an age that we remember 1973, not many did. That disagreement between the Faroes and Denmark was perfectly amicable. It was perfectly possible for people to have a different point of view. So in all of this, the point is that referendums have been pretty important, even for places which have had an overwhelming support for independence. And just to come back to these guys, obviously what happened in 1905 when they ended up in this situation where there was this row over consular representation for shipping agents. It's that sort of Al Capone approach to independence. It was a strangely small paperworky aspect of things. But when that disagreement happened, again, the King of Sweden couldn't believe that the people of Norway didn't want him as their king. So he insisted there was going to have to be a referendum, and was astonished to discover that, 368,000 men voted for independence, 184 voted against. And women were not given the vote at that time, so the suffragettes organised their own ballot for women, which had 300,000 votes. It was the same sort of proportions. So it's interesting to see that even despite the fact there was 90% plus support for independence in Iceland and in Norway, they all went through the legitimising process of having a referendum. That's just a thought from the past. But, yes, they grabbed their moment. But they spent the time before that moment arrived making powerful choices that left their people confident that they had the capacity to do anything. Now, as some of you who have read Blossom will know, I have some criticisms of all governments, including the current one, in terms of not empowering us as much as we need. We need councils in every town. We need land reform. We need to get the sense of ourselves and the power of what can come from understanding that all the assets of your country belong to the people. And you'll see that a big, big moment for the Norwegians occurred when that peasants' parliament realised that its national assets had been stolen, effectively, well, let's say bought. And it took a bold decision, which I'm sure the markets at the time wouldn't have liked, to basically convert outright ownership into long-term rental leases, and then made them progressively shorter until basically the rivers reverted to the control of the state. Now that was a real biggie, a big decision to take, and that was possible because people had a good conceit of what it was to have a powerful state. And I think years of being boiled like frogs in the post-Thatcher era have stopped us realising that it's normal for people to own assets and for the state to be the principal stakeholder. And above all, the big difference between Norway and Scotland is that currently Norway insists that the market is part of society, and in Britain, society has become just another part of the market. And that is totally wrong.
Thanks for waiting so patiently in the front row. We're going to take your question, and then I'm going to look for somebody from upstairs. So if you're upstairs and you've got a question, could you really wave your arm at me so I can see you properly? But first of all, the women in the front row.
It was brought up just in the documentary about the Norway's relationship with the EU. I was catching up with a bit of news. Corbyn had said something. I do try to avoid listening to him if possible. But apparently he had made some kind of comment about Norway Plus being the way that today. I've not got the full details, but that's where he wants to go. Yeah. You do get the impression sometimes in the wee stratosphere of Twitter that there are a lot of Scots who prefer the Norway option. So it was really just a question for both of you about, I personally would just go straight back in. Thanks very much. I don't like the idea of being out. But there are a few people I know that would like the Norway option. So it's just to see what you think about that.
Well, let's just remind ourselves what the man said about the Norway option. He said, we decided to join the markets without joining the political institutions, and it's been an uneasy compromise. So basically, Norway is part of the single market, but not part of the customs union. Very important to understand. Norway has no say, no vote, no seat at the top table in the European Union. Now, ultimately, it will be for the people and the Parliament of an independent Scotland to decide on Scotland's future relationship with the European Union. But as things presently stand, the mandate of the European Union referendum is that the majority of Scots wanted to remain part of the European Union. And what I and my colleagues are going to be voting on Tuesday next week, unless the Prime Minister pulls it again, and I don't think she is, because I think she knows now that in a sense she just has to lose this and move on. But there's a deal on the table on Tuesday. There's no other deal on the table. Norway Plus for the United Kingdom is pie in the sky, because in order to solve the border problem, you have to be in the customs union. Nobody is offering the United Kingdom Norway Plus at the moment. It's a unicorn and a convenient out for some people who can't face up to the fact that what we need is a second vote, informed on the facts, knowing that All the things that were promised last time round have proved to be undeliverable, and there's a deal on the table. There's only one deal on the table, and it's the deal we're voting on Tuesday. Now, some people are giving the impression that it's going to be possible to go back to Brussels and get a considerably different deal. That is pie in the sky. The other European Union nations might make some little tweaks to the current deal, and they might use some rhetoric to make it easier for Theresa May to sell it to the DUP and her Brexiteer rebels. But Norway Plus isn't on the table. And I'm arguing very, very strongly that the Scottish National Party MPs should not be distracted by what I call the unicorn of Norway Plus. We should vote down the deal, vote against the government in no confidence, and if we can't get a general election, then we should have a second vote. Now, I made a speech in London on Friday suggesting that what may happen is there might have to be a temporary cross-party government, a cross-party executive, to go to Brussels to get an extension of Article 50, not to revoke it, but to get an extension of Article 50, to hold a second EU referendum, then hopefully to win that across the UK, go back to Brussels, revoke Article 50, and then hold a general election. And I suggested that the price of the Scottish National Party's participation in such a coalition to deliver that limited result would be that the Scottish Parliament should be given the right to decide when a next independence referendum should be. Now, I was very vocal in getting the SNP to go behind the idea of a second vote on the EU, and I said at the time that the SNP cannot make supporting a second vote on the EU, they can't make the price of that a Section 30 order, because you can't get a Section 30 order from a cross-party movement as such as the People's Vote, which is no party and cross-party. But if our 35 votes are needed to prop up some temporary executive to save all the nations of the UK from the folly of a no-deal Brexit, then, when they need our votes in Parliament, that's a time to prop up an executive that we have a time to bargain. And I'm very much going to be pushing that argument in the SNP in the weeks to come. And I just want to say something. If there's any journalists in the audience, I'm not going to make any comment about what's happened in the SNP this week. People know that I believe in justice and due process, and I want to see that the right thing is done ultimately here. But what I will say is that the Scottish National Party is much bigger than Nicola Sturgeon or Alex Salmond. And I say that having had enormous respect for both of them and their different qualities. But one thing that may come out of this debacle in the SNP might be a more collegiate style of leadership, where more of us can be involved in the crucial decision-making. And I can guarantee anyone in this room that's a party member or cares about independence, that's what I'm going to be fighting for in the weeks and the months to come. I'm just going to let Lesley say something about the EU, because it's really Lesley that's supposed to be answering the questions, not me, and EU, Norway, single market, that stuff, because Lesley knows a lot about this. Yeah. And then we'll go up to the upstairs gallery for the next question.
Well, get your thing out of the way.
She's not asking
I'll
you,
tell you
my
after.
outfit.
I'll tell you, it's the leggings, isn't it? Yeah. Yes. Oh, right. Okay. I'll speak to you later. Right. Okay. So Norway. Right. Why is Norway the Norway option for the EA? Here is the simple reason Britain cannot do this. It requires acceptance of freedom of movement. Hello. I mean, I am astonished at the debate that's going on here, as if complex arrangements can be just pick and mix options. You didn't like the orange one, so you just leave that one out. You like the red one, so you'll have 4 of them. That is not the way this thing works, and it's typical of a British approach to stuff that runs roughshod over arrangements that have been in place for decades, which these small independent countries have forged themselves. So just as another little problem, Norway Disney want the UK, right? And it said it. And here's the astonishing thing about saying it. It's run by a Conservative government. So the Conservative government of Norway has said it doesn't want Britain in for lots of reasons. Because we're a marketised society, it doesn't fit with their kind of pattern. Because we're a whopper, they're all about 5 million size. And because there are already existing multinational arrangements that have been made, trading agreements that have been made, that would have to be chucked in the bin to start all over again, when nobody wants that. So, I mean, I know these are just little problems, really, but before you get into any further discussion of anything, this is not a flyer for Britain. Now, the thing for Norway is that it was never in the EU. So for it, the halfway house, it's called, a lot of people in Norway call it the Nike deal, because it's just do it. You have to abide by all the regulations of the EU, you don't get to have a say in them, and you pay between 80 and 90% of full membership for the privilege of not having any influence. But you do have, arguably, that level of control. And the point in Norway is the idea of becoming full EU members is about as popular as Theresa May's deal, right? There's no goers for it. Now, a lot of the bureaucrats in Oslo think it's a brilliant idea. I've spoken to lots of white-collar people in the capital who think that the European Union is the biggest, most powerful idea supporting peace that has ever been created. And they would love to be in it. But when the votes, 2 referendums happened in Norway, 70% of Oslo voted to join, and 70% of everywhere else voted not to, because they didn't trust Europe. They didn't trust anyone beyond their own country, such is their confidence in the kind of society they've created, and their fear that different standards in Europe would start diluting the powerful kind of society that they've created. So they're in a different situation because they were never in. So halfway is kind of fine for them. We are currently full EU members. We are EU citizens. We've been that for 40 years. So for us, there's a loss. For Norway, there's a partial gain, if you like. So that's a different situation for Scotland. But I'd have to say this, which is Scotland has options. No one in Norway is coming out saying, we don't want an independent Scotland in the EEA. We'd be the same size as them. And nobody in the fishing communities, who have played a very big part in influencing their countries not wanting to join, is saying of Scotland, oh gosh, we don't want them on board because they have a totally different outlook on life. We do have a similar outlook. But if we were to be in that halfway house, you'd have all the minus points listed already. And the thing is this, all the countries that are in, all the Nordic countries have very clear ideas about what's in their own interests as a country. A group I run called Nordic Horizons produced a wee book called McSmorgasbord. It's written by someone from each country, and it explains precisely why they do what they do. It's not about dogma. It's not about somebody's unicorn-driven dream. It's just really practical. The Finns, for example, are full EU members, and they're the only Nordic country in the euro. Why? Because they're cheek bajorrel with Russia. Now, someone said once of Scotland it was like being in bed with an elephant, our relationship to our southern cousins. And that's no nastiness, that's just a reflection on size. If that's true, then Finland is in bed with a stegosaurus, right? And so for that reason, the Finns have always had a constitutional bar on membership of NATO. Because what they're trying to say to Russia is, you didn't need to invade us. There will never, ever be an American base on Finnish soil. And actually, Sweden has the same constitutional bar. So where does their security come from? The EU. Now, people might think that's naive, that the EU will come to Finland's rescue should a resurgent Russia decide to cross the border. But when you look at the way that other EU members have come to the support of Ireland in the Brexit process, you might think, actually, that's not such a stupid insurance policy to have.
Yep, absolutely.
Now, Finland is never going to go to Iceland with about 94% of its income coming from fish, and say to them, hey guys, I know the common fisheries policy means you'd just be handing over half your wealth, but join the European Union because, hey, we're in and it suits us. Nobody would dream of doing that, nor would the Icelanders say to the Finns, hey, I know you're a bit nervous being beside Russia and everything and you're full members, but why don't you join the halfway house because it suits us very well. Each of these countries understands its own interests. And this is the challenge for Scotland, to ditch all the polemic and the dogma which characterises politics driven by Westminster, and start to talk about what's in our interests as a set of people, because that's a sort of new conversation for us. Let's look where we want to go, not where we've been. And to be honest with you, I can see pros and cons for both. And should we be dragged out of Europe against our will, the halfway house might be a staging post back in. All of that awaits next week. And there are sort of shorter answers to questions available.
Right, I can see a gentleman upstairs with the microphone. Go for it.
Can we have the upstairs mic on if you're on the faders? This is why people up there begin to develop conspiracy theories.
Maybe I turned it off.
Brilliant,
right.
okay.
I'd just like to endorse and support everything that you've said. I'd like to add a bit of perspective in the sense that I went to Norway as an 18-year-old hitchhiking around in 1965, and at that particular time, I didn't notice anything on the ground much different from Scotland. I went back to Norway in 2004, and it's amazing the number of tunnels, bridges, infrastructure, all of the things. You were very much aware of the positivity and what they had spent all that oil money on in the country there. I went to Iceland in 1970 and did a lot of walking about there, but at that particular time there was only one tarred road in Iceland, and that went from Keflavik Airport, because the Americans were there, to Reykjavik. And there was no road right round the whole country. After you left Reykjavik, it was dirt tracks, sort of area. I went back to Iceland last year. I was overwhelmed. There are roads everywhere. And if the glaciers washed away the bridges and the roads, they rebuilt them, sort of idea. And I was just doodling around last night, knowing I was going to come here. But I also looked up that the sort of GDP of, in other words, the total income per head of population, as you might say. And in Iceland, they earn $68,000 per head of population, sort of idea. In Norway, the same aspect is $99,000. In the UK, I think we come out at $39,000 per head of population. And if Wikipedia have to be taken as their word, using the estimates for oil revenue, Scotland comes out at $43,000. So whatever anybody else is saying, Scotland's keeping the UK afloat. Thank you.
Can I just say something about this question of taxation? Because it is, somewhere in the audience, the same thought is going through minds, which is, this is all very well, but a pint of lager in Norway costs a lot of money. Now, it sort of wounds me to think that discussions of our national interests hinge so closely on either football or blimmin' the price of a pint of lager. But what you heard Eirik explain there is kind of very to the point, that all the Nordics have a high wage, high cost, high tax society. And that scares people, because we are the opposite. We are a low wage, low cost, low income society by comparison. But what you get for high taxes, and let's also chuck all our stealth stuff on in here, but anyway, if you were paying about 40% personal tax, which you are in Norway, what do you get for that? You get quite a lot. You get an education system in which it's illegal to make profit from education. So you get all the children of the, if I was going to say elite, but Norwegians would cough on that word because they have the smallest income gap in the world, along with Sweden. So basically the people, the professionals, are all at school with, it was the comprehensive ideal that Scotland wanted, but it's delivered. You get kindergarten, excellent standards of childcare, from 1 till mostly 7. Now I know a lot of people will feel that the kind of traditional upbringing hasn't done any of us any harm. I didn't go to a kindergarten. What's happened in society is that children need engagement. And with 1.2 children, you don't get a lot of engagement, no matter how hard a parents try. The average family has got a parent or 2 parents out to work. All of these conditions are pushing against a child getting enough engagement. At the top of the child well-being indexes every year is Denmark and Cyprus. Cyprus, because they do still have families with 4 bairns, 2 grannies, 2 grandas, a lot of goats. It's a lot of interactivity and support and engagement. I don't know if you're noticing, that's not us anymore. So the smart countries, like all the Nordics, have decided they need to have a kindergarten system so the kids are being engaged really early on, not educated in a formal sense, and they're leaving the kids to the age of 6 or 7, which is the age 88% of countries in the world have decided children should go to school. 12% of the world's countries think that 4 and 5 is a good idea, and they are all former British colonies. So you get, for your taxes, the confidence that you can go to work with your child being in a brilliant environment, which is in Norway invariably outdoors as well. So all the kind of paranoid fear that is being developed here about nature doesn't exist. And you get excellent welfare. You get the confidence of all of that. So people are willing to pay 40% because the levels of trust in Nordic society between citizens and government are the highest in the world. Compare Britain. Would anyone honestly put another penny into tax to give to a Westminster government that would be likely to spend it on Trident? You know, you would have your doubts. Would you be happy to give a penny to a government that might use it to hatch another system of such extreme cruelty as universal credit that people are killing themselves? Would you? Because I'll tell you, I wouldn't pay another penny to a Westminster government of the current complexion, or I can't imagine actually the confidence I would need to have to move to a high tax economy under the present circumstances. So that's why there's a big difference. It's one we'll have to bridge when we're ready, but we need to unpick in our heads the reason that we are as we are and why the Norwegians have this high tax contribution.
I'm conscious of the time because there's going to be some music in the cafe at the side shortly, but I think we've got enough time to take another 2 quick questions for Lesley, or if you must, you can ask me a question. So I'm slightly blinded by the lights here, so I can see a hand waving at the very back of the room, and somebody up at the top. So we'll take the person at the back of the room first, and the person at the top. And then if you could just keep your questions fairly succinct, that'd be great.
Right, so when we look at Norway today, we see a political system shaped by a lot of consensus, and part of that political system, the way their proportional representation that works. But like Scotland, I think there's actually a parallel worth drawing between Norway and Scotland, is that modern Scotland and modern Norway are both products of like several decades of class struggle. Working class institutions, like the reason why the working class in Norway.
Can I ask you to give us a question because we are short for time?
So, what do you think the parallels are between sort of several decades of social democratic hegemony in Norway and in Scotland, and the way sort of working class struggle framed their identities.
Great,
today.
that's super, thanks. We'll come to that in a wee minute. I'll just take the question from the top as well, please. So for those who didn't hear that, the question was, is there any plan to make a film on Finland? Over to you, Lesley.
No. No, simply that we did this, and I should have actually thanked people, because I'm sure there will have been people who contributed to the crowdfund in this room, in which case many thanks, because you made this possible. Along with a grant from the Scottish Independence Foundation that helped get the Faroese film off the ground. But basically, the crowdfunder dried up, and I didn't want us to get into the awkward situation where if we kept it open, we would basically get enough, we would get more money from the public, but not enough to make another film. So the other thing is, just as a small point, I've been kind of doing this since June, and pretty well without income, so I kind of need to get back to something resembling a day job. And I know that could all be rectified. Maybe there will be a point where people have an appetite for yet more Nordics. But you see, there's a big pregnant pause there, not a roar. So, you know, the thing is, we'll see where we're going at the current moment, because the amount of effort you have to put in to planning this, booking people, researching it, pinning them down, it basically means you can't do anything else. And it might just be we're in a situation where there are other fish to fry. On the question at the back about the working class struggles in Scotland and Norway, it is a very different issue, because actually the working class in Norway were the peasants. They were not an urban proletariat by and large. And actually, because they seized power so early, they made sure Norway wasn't a vastly urbanised country. Or rather to say, there is a 10-city policy in Norway which keeps fielding money and income back out of Oslo. So, of course, there was industrialisation, but where it happened was where there was the hydropower, and that was basically all over the river systems of Norway, not just focused in Oslo. So there's a totally different profile where landless Scots were industrialised and urbanised and had nothing, had no security of tenure, owned nothing, and were forced into the brutal conditions of Glasgow with no option but to be there, with nowhere to go back to. In Norway, it wasn't a walk in the park living off the land. It's crap. But it was an option. And lots of professors I've spoken to in Norway will say that of Scotland. The reason that your industrialisation was so brutal is because your predecessors had nowhere else to go back to. And actually, that's still the same situation. So there's such a huge difference in our backgrounds, but the skill of involving peasants right from the beginning in Norway has been what's kept the social democratic train on course, because it straddles the urban country divide, which really still is far too large in Scottish society.
Thank you, Lesley. And thank you also to everybody who asked our question. I think we've had a really stimulating discussion. And I'm just going to wind up quickly by thanking Lesley again and our colleague Al for this fantastic film and the other films that they've made. And also to thank Mike Blackshaw for organising this event. It's been a real feat of organisation, as Lesley said earlier, to get such a great venue and to fill it out. And can I thank also the staff of the venue, who, as always in the Queen's Hall, have been absolutely fantastic. I also want to say a quick thank you to the Yes Choir, who sang for us at the beginning, and also to Musica Nordica, who played so beautifully for us, and to remind you that Andrew Gordon's going to be playing in the cafe at the end of this. But before you go, Lesley mentioned the importance of crowdfunding for her project, and I'm very conscious of the importance of crowdfunding for the litigation that I was involved in that got the ruling from the Court of Justice, and I want to thank anyone in this room who donated to that. And so you can probably tell that I'm working up to asking you for more money, but it's not for me. There will be a collection at the end to help support the fantastic work that Mike Blackshaw and others do at the Yes Hub. And if you could dig in, anything you can afford to give to that would be really very much appreciated. And can I thank you for being such a fantastic audience, and hope to see you all again soon at another equally fantastic event. Thank you.
Right, so that's us for now. Thanks for watching. I'd like to just mention that I decided to go at the back because we're accommodated very well with the audio. The video was never going to be very well defined from the back here using an iPad, so I hope that trade-off was okay. I think decent audio is always more important than crystal clear video for these live broadcasts. So thanks for watching, and I'll catch you later.